Okay, everybody, we're back, as I normally say each time for Doubts Aloud podcast. We're on episode 11, and this is going to be a very interesting one because we have a new host, if you like, and it's Dr. Steve Tomkins, and he is going to be on the show right the way throughout. So it's going to be somewhat different because we've had several guests on the Doubts Aloud podcast, and Steve is incredibly unique because not a lot of people know this, but I have two hobbies, and one is this, and another one is I'm in a band, and the lead guitarist of that band is none other than Dr. Steve Tomkins.
Oh, really?
And yeah, and so literally, this is a recording on a Monday. On Wednesday, we've got our rehearsal for the band, and suddenly we change hats, and I'm the lead singer of a band, and Steve's the guitarist. Today, I'm back as the normal host here, and Steve is going to put on his church history hat, really, and his speciality there.
We should save some time, combine the two together and do some theological rock and roll.
That sounds great. So Ed, you know Steve as well, so can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, well, I came across Steve as a member of the London Unbelievable discussion group and was highly impressed right from the start, and he has now done two talks with us. The first one was a Progressive Christians Manifesto, and more recently a talk on church history, which is going to be the first of two, and followed by a great discussion that he led. So it's his knowledge on that has made me eager to have Steve with us.
Absolutely. And Francis?
Well, I was there for Steve's talk on church history, which was very interesting.
Yes, I first witnessed that talk, Steve, when you did it several months back now at your church in Southeast London. And I just thought, this is amazing. This is so, this is a cross between, well, you describe it, Steve. What was your church history talk?
Well, it was somewhere in between a church history lecture and a 1 hour stand-up comedy show. It wasn't exactly either. It didn't really have the rigor of a proper lecture or the entertainment value of stand-up comedy, but it was somewhere in between the two, I guess.
Great.
Yes.
And
I love the links between Charlemagne and the EU.
Yes.
Yes, and ended on a cliffhanger, so we're all waiting.
Yes, it ended halfway through church history, and we're waiting to hear what happens next. Of course, we probably know if we looked hard enough, but in the form that Steve does it, we're waiting for the new year for that one. But before we get back to that, and before we get back to Steve talking about this, Ed, can you just talk about more other news for this section?
Well, you're inviting me to blow my own trumpet.
I am.
Justin Briley from the Unbelievable podcast, which I'm hoping most of our listeners are also fans of and listen to. He invited me to talk about doubts, knowing that our show is Doubts Aloud, and a lovely Texan pastor, who I thought was a lovely man. He has written a book about doubts, much of which was excellent and some of which I disagree with strongly. So it made for what I thought was a great discussion, but I'm hoping I'm going to get some strokes from you lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Francis, why don't you kick off on that?
Well, I thought, as ever, you dealt with it pretty well. You seem to be pretty much on the money to me. Can I give you some constructive criticism? No, I can't really think of anything. I thought it was a good discussion because it was quite, it was so good-mannered on both sides, so pleasant on both sides, although I think, what was the rudest thing you said to him?
You're selfish.
He was selfish, yeah.
That's right.
Oh, good, you remember.
You're selfish. Yes.
Oh, do we remember? Everyone remember.
Yes. And that was as rude as it got.
Yes.
But perhaps you'd like to unpack what it was that he said that made you respond by telling him he was selfish.
Because I don't think Steve has heard that one on the Unbelievable.
I have heard it, yes.
Oh, you have heard it? Oh, great. Well, great. So, Steve, after that, then you can give some comment on Ed's.
Okay. I did it to be provocative and to make the show interesting. So it wasn't all just backslapping fun. And what I was doing was conveying this message from this Victorian philosopher that I'm very keen on, W. Clay Clifford, who had this one-hit wonder essay called The Ethics of Belief. And I won't repeat everything that I said on the Unbelievable show, but what it boiled down to was that if you get to your beliefs about particularly a kind of worldview belief like Christianity or naturalism, say that I hold, if you get to it without using reason and evidence, you are being immoral. And I prefer to use the word selfish because I could link that to the argument that Clifford made to show how you're being selfish, you're worrying, thinking about yourself, not about others, when you think you're being ethical and good, but actually you're just doing your own thing for your own sake in a selfish way. So I think saying selfish is probably a bit overstating it, but again, I want to be provocative and make the discussion interesting.
Well, yeah, and could you just make reference then, Ed, to that bit that you found quite unbelievable with that discussion, I believe, with the quote about if in fact evidence was showing that it wasn't true or Christianity wasn't true, then he would still go with that. That's quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'll quote it word for word. This is something that my pastor friend Austin found from some source that was a private letter of Dostoyevsky, the famous novelist, the one that Christians love to quote. And so he did the brothers, is it Kasimov or something?
Something like that.
Yeah, that's. I should read it actually because it sounds amazing. Anyway, so it's that author, and he wrote, and he was a Christian.
Yeah.
If anyone could prove to me that Christ is outside the truth, and if the truth really did exclude Christ, I should prefer to stay with Christ and not with truth.
Wow.
And that was something that Austin fully endorsed and was why he stayed a Christian, despite his doubts. At heart, of course, the books are stacked full of stuff, but that at heart was the main reason.
That's quite a... Well, maybe we'll bring Steve in on this. So, Steve, what would you comment on that?
Yeah, I, as someone who stands, I suppose, on the Christian side of the Christian skeptic divide, I did find that, Ed, you did a rather better job of making holes in Austin's position than he did of yours. I was really struck by what, for me, was the most audacious argument that Austin made, that he claimed that all reasonable people would have to accept that Christianity was the best thing that had ever happened in the world because it brought a whole new moral outlook into the world. And therefore, if anyone has any moral criticisms of Christianity, they're invalidated because they are made from within Christianity's moral framework, which it was, kind of nice rhetorical sleight of hand, but I don't think I could go along with that.
That is quite a common approach, isn't it? That if you say something about the Old Testament and the Old Testament genocides or anything of that sort, it is quite a common response to say, well, what standard do you have to judge it against? You don't have one, so you can't make any judgment.
Yes, but one thing that struck me about that was that Christianity puts quite a lot of store on the idea that just believing the right thing, just teaching the right thing isn't enough. You actually have to do it. And I don't know, put me in mind of, imagine a Christian educator who, teaches her children every day that God is love, and then once in a while beats them to within an inch of their lives for pursuing independent thought. Now, at the end of their schooling, those children might say to their teacher, you were a horrible, terrible person for treating us like this. And she could say, but, you only know that because I was the one who taught you that God is love. Well, that's not really good enough, is it? Just because you've taught a moral framework doesn't give you an excuse for not living within it.
And the big thing, though, Steve, what can come later in this episode is, in fact, correlating everything that you just said to church history and how they've acted as Christians throughout history with relation to the moral, so-called moral framework within Christianity, because it's pretty varied, to say the very least. And certainly I'll be bringing that up later, if you see the point I'm making there.
I do, and I do agree with Austin. I take what he says, that Christianity has brought a new moral framework into the world, but the idea that then protects Christianity from all moral criticism, that's an audacious argument, as I say.
Seems to be. Ed?
Yes, I didn't want to argue against the sort of factual side of it, of what Christianity had done or not. Unbelievable have covered that before, and I just feel a bit out of my depth with it. Leave it to people like that lovely chap from the humanist, British humanism, I think it's called, something like that. And Justin accepted that I didn't want to go there, and other people had covered it better than I was likely to. I still don't know, almost like by evolution, that the best moral approach was going to come to the fore in the end, and that's why Christianity has survived, because it does a better job at giving us good morals than other faiths. But that's I don't think it's a suggestion. I'm not sure I'd want to absolutely stand by that.
Okay, well, so I think that's covered sort of a couple of news points, both Steve's talk on church history, which we'll get into later, and with a particular interview with Steve, and Ed, obviously your time, your third, is it, or fourth time now?
Yeah.
But this is not good because I've only done 3.
I've only done 2.
And you've only done 2. This is not good. It doesn't bode well. So I'll keep quiet about that. It's time.
I haven't done one. What am I doing wrong?
Sorry, Steve?
I haven't done one. I want to know what I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, I'll do my best to get you on.
We need to tell Justin to get you on.
He'll get you on.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Ed's normally pretty good like that, and it'll pop up, I'm sure. Gosh, I mean, when we interview you a bit more, Steve, we'll just talk about your background and how you got to where you got to. But next, Ed, what have we got next?
Well, we have been dancing around the idea of pragmatic arguments. And that's something I'd like us to cover in Reason and God. I'll just give a little bit of background before we jump in. We've got this overall theme of our podcast of this book of 50 Arguments for God. And the kind of randomizer cuffs up one from the book. And the last one we had was this chapter on the Son of God. And I call it a dud, because it didn't actually offer any argument in favour of God or Christianity or anything. And when we have a dud, we dip into the box of arguments for God that the book doesn't cover. And the randomizer has coughed up pragmatic arguments for God. And so that's going to be a theme that we'll be talking about for the next section. And the section is called Reason and God.
Okay, so welcome to this section called Reason and Dud. Oh, sorry. No, it's not Reason and God. So pragmatic arguments. So Francis, take it away.
Right. Pragmatic arguments are an example of a fallacy, which is arguing to the consequence. So you advance an argument that says, well, if you believe X, then the consequence of believing X is Y, and Y is terrible, so therefore don't believe X. But, of course, that's a fallacious reasoning. It doesn't disprove X because it brings about or it inevitably entails an unpleasant consequence. You have to follow where the logic or where the evidence leads. And I think if you try to imagine the argument being put, shall we say, in a court case, if the defence tried to argue, well, if you find my client guilty, he'll have to go to prison, and if he goes to prison, his wife and his children will be thrown out on the streets, and this is a terrible consequence. Therefore, you ought to find him not guilty. I don't think anyone would expect that to get very far. And in fact, when an argument of that sort is referenced in court, it tends to be more from the other way around, that the defence will point out that if you acquit my client, if you find him not guilty, then you may feel worried that the victims are not getting any result from the court case, but you mustn't let that affect you. You must only follow the evidence. You mustn't think about the consequences of your verdict in those terms. You must only think about where the evidence points. And so I think that you can all see, when it's taken in that context, why it would be wrong to follow any line of argument purely on pragmatism. Ed, any comments?
Well, my first comment is I just love that pragmatic arguments are in fact just a different name for the fallacy of arguing. What do you call it? Arguing from consequences.
Argument from consequences.
Yeah. So it's just the same thing, just a different name. I wanted to break it down a bit because of I really believe that Austin, my unbelievable interlocutor, he believes, because of pragmatic arguments, and he has two. One is the good things that his belief does to himself. He thinks it makes him a better person. And the other is he thinks it's good for the world to believe it. So does anyone want to kind of pick up on one or other of those?
I follow the argument perfectly that if you want to know the truth, if that's the thing you're after, then arguments from pragmatism are not going to lead you to the truth. But I'm not sure that what we all always want in every situation is the truth. And I imagine that most of us have been in situations where we decide that there are actually more important things than telling the truth. And there are some times when we've hidden the truth from someone because, the truth would absolutely devastate them. And so, if what you want is truth, then pragmatic arguments are not going to lead you there. But if pragmatic arguments are not just about truth, but what the right thing to do is, then maybe in some circumstances, the right thing to do is not the truth.
Yes, I see what you mean. I mean, I suppose in that circumstance, it won't be an argument. I think it's only when there's an attempt to use it as an argument that we have an issue. I can accept that the truth, here's my take on it, the truth is not always of foremost importance. As a default position, yes, I think we should tell the truth. And as a default position, I think that the truth is important. But it doesn't mean that there aren't exceptional circumstances where it's the right thing to do is to withhold the truth. If I were to go to a funeral and the deceased's wife or child were to say to me, "Oh, well, Daddy's in heaven now with God," I don't have to be that person who says, "Oh, no, I think you'll find he isn't. I think you'll find, this is just a foolish myth that you've told yourself and for which there's not an ounce of evidence." I mean, no, you don't have to be an idiot. Shall I bowdlerize it? I mean, I think everybody knows what I'm thinking of. You don't have to be an idiot. You can exercise some restraint and some
as
proportion.
the movie goes,
and
you can't handle the truth. Yeah.
And wasn't that kind of what Austin was saying, making an analogy with his argument from Dostoyevsky? He wasn't saying, because of what Dostoyevsky said, Christianity is true because I prefer it to the truth. What he was saying is, if I had to choose between the truth and Christianity, I would choose Christianity. Now, that doesn't make Christianity true, but for him, it's more important than the truth. And I think we've just agreed that sometimes some things can be more important than truth. That doesn't make them true, but it makes them important.
Yes, sometimes I don't think I could wish as a general rule to be deluded or deceived. Deceiving myself even. I think it's more, for me, it's more exceptional one-off circumstances. Personally, I could not wish for that as a general rule in my life, that I would be largely deluded on anything.
But I have family members that would absolutely be horrified at not having the childhood experience of Santa Claus that they had by just the gritty reality of the truth. And so I do understand the point that Steve's making in certain realms.
Yeah.
Humanity, like a whole child. Yeah, you end up growing naturally out of Santa Claus, and it's great. But that childhood dream of it actually being real for a period is actually quite wonderful for some people, and yet it's blatantly not true. But so it raises the question of what is the realm of what can be perceived as true? How important is that to humans? It's an interesting question.
Well, I think, yes. I mean, I think for Santa Claus, that is specific to childhood. We do treat children differently from the way we treat adults.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and the article I had there was from William James's Ethics of Belief. Clifford's Ethics of Belief, and William James, the famous American, picked up on that, and he wrote a couple of decades later on the same points, often refuting some of the stuff Clifford was saying. And in that encyclopedia entry is a great account of obviously more modern, of a man with a teenage son, and in the son's bedroom he could sort of smell weed and stuff, and he chooses to believe that his son is not indulging in dangerous drugs or any drugs because he thinks it's better for his relationship with his son for him not to believe that. So that's a kind of a pragmatic reason to influence your belief, which perhaps is valid, who knows.
Do you have any thoughts on it, Ed, as someone who obviously feels quite strongly that...
I do feel strongly. I feel that we should hold our nerve and let the truth and reality impact our beliefs. And as soon as we start saying, I know best, it's like an aloof dictatorship or oligarchy where the elite decides what the kind of masses should be believing, and that just stifles everything, allowing us all to and encouraging us all to believe what's true will in the long run end in good consequences, because of you can't fight reality. So it's difficult. It sounds like I'm making a pragmatic answer to a pragmatic argument. I'm not sure.
Yes, I can see the kind of self-referential point that maybe is going in there, but I think perhaps to some extent, because I think we all believe that morality is based on consequences, you are just referring back to the real consequences of a particular approach, and you can't entirely divorce morality from consequences. But I think the thing is that these are real consequences, real and observable and objective consequences. Is that a fair response, do you think, to your...
Yes, that's right. On the show, I picked up what I thought were some very obvious consequences of belief, such as choosing between humanitarian aid and sort of Bible distribution. Both people, the aid worker and the Bible distributor, want Nepal to be a better place. And they're both having their worldview and beliefs guide how that is put into practice. So it becomes really important how you derive your beliefs. And in that circumstance, it's completely obvious that truth is more important than what you feel is better for the world.
And the way that you set out your position, Edward, it sounds to me, is if you're saying that that truth has the absolute value, and obviously different values are often in conflict with each other, and we have to decide which is more important. And I think you're saying that truth will always win. So truth is the ultimate good and has to trump every other consideration. Is that a fair characterization of what you're saying?
Yes, it's almost like a meta thing. So it's not like, is it better to lie to the Gestapo or to tell the truth to the Gestapo and have the victims in the attic exposed? It's not that kind of either or morality. It's like a meta thing that you decide you want to be moral in the world, but you can't be moral in the world without good information as to what the world is really like. Otherwise, you'll be blundering about. So if the afterlife doesn't exist, then concentrating on giving people an afterlife in heaven, not hell, really is a terrible use of time.
So why are you saying that you should lie to the Gestapo in that situation?
Well, I use the Gestapo example as a typical example that moralists use to show that moral principles can both be good and right, but they can be in conflict with each other. And I'm saying when they're in conflict, thing which isn't in conflict, because it sits over the whole thing.
I mean, Ed, even in the Bible, you should call me Bible answer man here. Even in the Bible story where there's the lie where I think it's when they go into the cities of Canaan or something, and they hide the prostitute is hidden, and they hide the people. That's right. They hide a couple of the Hebrews there, and then when they ask if there's anyone there, they say no or something like that. So they are sort of lying for the pragmatic benefit of saving the Hebrew people. Wouldn't a story like that relate to what you're saying?
Yeah, that would just be another
example that you would use. It's an example you would use, and there's one in the Bible doing that very thing, actually. The sort of that's the Gestapo one, isn't it? So right there.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is in contrast to that.
Right.
Maybe I'm getting a bit too complicated. That one moral principle can be in conflict with another moral principle when both are good moral principles. So not lying and protecting people are both in themselves wonderful things, but in this case, they are in conflict. What I'm saying is that with my principle from Clifford, it sits over the whole thing. There's not that you can't be moral in the world without knowing what the world is like and what the problems are you're trying to solve.
Right.
But the pragmatic argument, I thought you three were all saying, was wrong because it's always right to choose the truth. And the pragmatic argument says, if it's better to believe a falsehood or if it's better to tell a falsehood, then we should do that for the sake of pragmatism. And were the three of you not saying that you should? Yes. And so, and so Austin was saying that there was something more important to him than believing the truth, and potentially that's possible, isn't it? That there could be two values in conflict. One of them is truth, and the other one is something more important than truth. And so, it might be the right thing in that situation to believe or to tell something that's not true.
I think if you always, if you start from a position that truth is down your list of priorities, and it's always down your list of priorities, that's where you run into trouble. I think you have to start from the default position that truth is important, and it would only be in exceptional circumstances that you could decide to dispense with truth and allow something to override it. I think that's true with most moral principles. I mean, there are circumstances in which it's right to hurt people. There are circumstances in which it's right to, perhaps even to betray people. Depends who they are and what the consequence of your betraying them is. But it's, as a general principle, I don't think you can always say, well, here truth is always going to be down here and something else is always going to be up there. You have to, in each circumstance, weigh the importance of truth and the importance of whatever the conflicting consideration is and decide which is more important.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's move on to the most famous pragmatic argument there is when it comes to religion, and that is, blow your trumpets, Pascal's wager. We all love Pascal's wager. I'm sure we've all got something to say on it. So,
good old Pascal.
Yeah. Andrew, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think Pascal's wager is obviously quite well known in a lot of circles if you're talking on podcasts like this or come from thinking Christian backgrounds or theistic backgrounds. Well, sorry, Christian backgrounds. But I think my take is probably slightly different than, say, what Steve might say or other people. But mine was because of my thing in Christianity, which is the awareness of diversity. That the idea that the way it's been put is like, well, if you're wrong, and you've got hell in its traditional form with Christianity at the sort of beck and call on one side, and then you've got sort of atheism on the other, or just not paganism, which is non-Christianity. And it's like, okay, if you've not lost anything in this humanistic, naturalistic life, whereas if you're wrong, you have lost everything and you go to this eternal hell. That's the kind of way that it was put to me in the past. But so much has changed, and so much ignorance, I think, is in that presentation. And that's just internally, because for me, I was very much aware very, very early on that different forms of Christianity actually put the hell threat to other Christians. And I think Francis has mentioned this before from an outside observation, but it was true. I was aware from my childhood that Catholics were not Christians. So if you stacked your horse, as it were, and you went with Catholic Christianity, then you were as bad as the non-Christian who was rejecting Christianity in one sense, or deceived, and you wouldn't attain salvation. And that's an obvious one. I mean, I've met Catholics who said I wasn't a Christian, and I know lots of Protestants who said they weren't, but then what if Jehovah's Witnesses were right, for example, who really do think they've got the truth? Then so many other people are not saved in that sense. Or what if Islam was right in another religion? And then when I went to YWAM, that's a missionary organization called Youth with a Mission, we were under very, very strong teaching at the time that even you could lose your own salvation literally on a daily basis. So you could actually be really, really, I mean, Steve might be quite surprised about that, or you, Ed, but there was a point where I thought I wasn't a Christian literally because of this different sin that you might do. So even if you could say you better choose Christianity in case you lose out, you were even in Christianity thinking you may not even make it. And so I found that with all the diversity, what are the chances that you've got it right? You're still under that gamble, and you're thinking, and this will relate to the video that I put at the end of this show, the Rowan Atkinson one, because that sort of demonstrates a sort of similar point. So anyway, that's my, I suppose, a sermon on that one.
Great.
Yeah.
I look forward to that. I think we'll put the link to it in the show notes.
Yes, certainly.
Okay.
And okay, so let's have Steve. What is your thing about Pascal's wager?
I quite like Pascal's wager, actually. I feel like I'm getting myself in the kind of devil's advocate corner here, or I don't know, probably it's the wrong context to use that. Don't know. But it's not a failed argument for the existence of God, is it? Because Pascal's starting point was that you can't know whether God exists. It's not the kind of thing a person can know, and yet you have to decide whether you're going to live a religious life or not live a religious life, and there's no third way there. You have to decide. So you can't know, but you have to decide. And so Pascal's wager for me is quite a good description of the way that when we make that step of commitment to live a religious life, we perform a kind of cost-benefit analysis of being religious. What have I got to gain? What have I got to lose either way? What have I got to gain? Pascal talks about goodness and truth. What have I got to gain or lose in goodness and truth, in knowledge and happiness? And the data that I would crunch myself in making that calculation, whether to be religious or not, is a bit different from Pascal's, because he does put everlasting happiness into the scales, although I don't think he does mention everlasting punishment at all. That wasn't part of his calculation, and I don't really think about everlasting life at all. So my calculation is more this worldly. But apart from that, I do weigh up the same ideas that Pascal did. Will belonging to this religion encourage me to act in ways that make me more happy or less happy? Will it make me a better person or a worse person? Will this religion ask me to deny truth? Will it make me better able to see the truth? Will it make me true to who I am, or will it stop me being true to who I am? So I think it's quite reasonable to be weighing those considerations against one another in deciding whether to make that leap of faith into being religious or not.
That, I think, is a very, very different take on it, Steve. Very, very good as well, the way you outline that. But that's certainly, my response was the response to what I was taught. And I was certainly taught it in the idea, in the apologetics books and everything. And I think Ed will probably think the same as this, that it was very much the counterbalance of the afterlife of the traditional hell. And it's like, if you just sort of live a so-called good humanist life, but it all turns out to be true, and it wasn't presented as like the existence of God. It was really presented as an afterlife threat, and you better, if you might as well choose it just in case hell is real. And it's funny because that's probably, according to what you're saying, ripping it out of Pascal's own even presentation and being taken on by later people. I would imagine then.
I mean, yes, he did talk about everlasting life and not wanting to miss out on that.
Right.
And, to a certain extent, I agree with that, because, I say that everlasting life isn't really something that I include in my calculation. But, I do agree with him that, although we can't know if everlasting life is a thing, even if there's only a slim possibility that it is a thing, then that's worth bearing in mind when we make our decision about religion, because I wouldn't want to miss out on that if that was available.
Right.
But what I disagree with him on in this is that if there is everlasting life out there and it's being allocated by God, it seems to me, not Pascal, but to me, it seems preposterous that God would make his judgment on the basis of, tribal religious affiliation to one group or another, or that God would make his judgment on whether we're worthy of everlasting life on the basis of our opinion on this metaphysical question that nobody knows the answer to. So, that question is no use to me in choosing a religion, because it seems to me whichever religion I choose, or if I choose not to have a religion, that I don't see how that ought to make a difference to what God decides, if God does decide about everlasting life.
Yeah.
God might disagree.
I think
you're
feelings taking the sting out of how most people
see it. But that's pretty good, though. It's a good alternate take, I think.
I mean, I think...
Yeah.
So, Ed?
I was going to say, I think that... For a lot of people, without ever having heard of Pascal, for quite a lot of Christians, they don't need to have it put in Pascal's quite intellectual way to have this notion of, oh my goodness, I'd better protect myself. This is my insurance policy. This is literally my fire insurance. Is to believe in God, and that's a very human thing, because humans are more risk averse than they are benefit incentivized. So we fear risk more than we are inclined to benefit. So the much cruder way that it is often put by some Christians who use this kind of, it's not really an argument, more of a threat, that sort of crude, instinctive way is probably going to be more effective than Pascal's more nuanced approach, which accentuated the positive.
But people really do this, and people bring up their children this way, and it really is a real thing.
What you mean? Our interpretations of how it's been put to us, Ed? You mean?
Yeah, the kind of typical. You choose God as well. Fire insurance is
fire insurance.
Way of putting it.
Yeah.
And
well, Steve's presented it in a way that's almost humanist, could argue.
Yeah.
It's this life-based,
It's quite easy to have some fun with this, because if you pick up that line of argument and sort of take it to its logical conclusion, you pick the religion that's got the worst possible hell. So Chris Date's religion is out the window immediately, because the hell is only quite a short-lived bit of torture and horribleness before you're destroyed forever, and that's so you're free of it. But so you need to go for a religion that's got a much worse hell than that. Maybe probably a Muslim. Maybe they're quite
Muslim, probably today. And then there's Christian Universalists, and I wouldn't be surprised, Steve, if you would land in some form of Christian Universalism. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about your backstory soon, but that may not be the case. But I'm just saying, as part of the more progressive forms of Christianity today, Pascal's view of the afterlife might be quite different from yours, or from at least other progressive evangelicals.
Yeah, and my version of it would take you in the exact opposite direction to what Ed has just described about choosing the one with the worst hell, because the religion that's got the worst hell is going to not be the best religion that's going to make you into the best person you can be.
Right.
It's not going to make you into the happiest and most positive person you could be. That's not going to be a healthy environment to pursue, I don't think.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. What a great thing to have such a different take. And of course, Ed's and my stories are very much similar, because that's the background of our teaching. And I think, Steve, knowing a little more about church history, and one thing I've picked up in church history is that people that actually make an argument on a famous name, the later followers often add to it. It's argued with Calvinism that Calvin isn't really a true Calvinist like some Calvinists. So there's the Pascal people seem to have taken this on possibly way beyond what he probably turned in his grave, hearing probably what some people might have said about his words. So
it gets crude but effective, doesn't
it?
It's nuanced when the creator comes up with it, but down the line it just becomes what works.
Yeah, that's right. What works, and obviously, as I can't even say it. What am I trying to say? An evangelist. No, not evangelical. Evangelistic. Sorry, approach to Pascal's wager is very, very different to how Steve has presented Pascal himself talking about it. So that's interesting and a good point to learn from, I would say.
The classic kind of responses to Pascal's wager. One is, we've talked about quite a lot, that it's not a binary choice between a particular version of Christianity and atheism. There's a myriad of choices within religion, and you could really annoy God by choosing the wrong one and end up with a terrible deal. So that's one response. And the other one is that it's just ridiculous to think that God will be impressed with our attempts to deceive him, that we're believing something we don't really believe. And that he'll be impressed, with us, even just believing without due reason, just to get him to like us. He just, who would actually be impressed by that and well disposed towards it? It just seems so human centered.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me about it is that it reiterates a theme that I find all the time, that's a huge difference between believers and non-believers. And it's something that you will hear each side say their own version, as if it was just unequivocally and unarguably the truth. So you will always find that all the time, that unbelievers will say, you can't choose your belief. You cannot, it's not a choice. And then on the other hand, you will hear believers say, we have freedom to choose. And I have actually had this argument with believers who have insisted that belief is a choice. And on one occasion that, yes, if they were sufficiently motivated, they could choose to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. I couldn't persuade them to believe it for, say, 10 minutes and then unbelieve it and come back to me and tell me how they'd done it. But they were adamant that was a choice that was open to them. Could have done it if they wanted to. They just didn't want to.
Well, let's see what a progressive
right.
Christian
Okay.
makes
What do
of
you
that.
think?
Well, I'm really interested in this idea that, choosing a religion isn't binary, because we've got all those religions out there to choose from. But it seems to me that in actual fact, the way that we generally work on the whole is rather more binary than that, in that there's only one religion that we would seriously consider. For Pascal, he was in 17th century middle class French person for whom there were Calvinists out there, but if he was going to choose a religion, he would never be a Calvinist. Think of people in Ireland today. There's a lot of people choosing between Roman Catholicism and atheism. They're not going to choose the Salvation Army. It's just not on the table at all. If you are having to choose between being a Sikh and a Sufi Muslim, or a snake handling Pentecostal, then Pascal's wager isn't a lot of use for you. But in the world that quite a lot of people live in, there's not actually that many religions that they would take seriously.
Yeah, so that's why we're moving on with the times, isn't it? And today we're in a smaller world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm quite keen to hear what Steve makes of this. So I bat on about this quite often, actually. I think atheist prayer is the way to go. So what I'm suggesting is that the person who is not knowing whether God exists or not is in the situation that Pascal sets up. And instead of jumping in and believing the thing that gives you the best result, all you need to do is ask God to help you to get to the truth. And so if God is good and wants us to find the truth, then he'll help us. If he's an evil git, then we're stuffed anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. And if he doesn't exist, then there's nothing obviously negative comes from that either. So this is actually the genuine, honest and sort of truth-seeking way to approach it, not trying to deceive ourselves, not trying to deceive God, just being completely honest about the situation, saying, well, God, maybe you are there. Help me find you, and try to make God generic rather than limit him to the job God of your parents or society. I've got two added bonuses for this approach. One is that if there isn't an answer, and God doesn't deem to answer this prayer, that is evidence in itself, in the same way that it would be evidence if God suddenly wrote a message in the clouds or something a bit more realistic. That would be an answer then, and useful information in the search. Then God not answering is also useful information in the search, because it leads to the negative result. Provides evidence towards a negative result, which is helpful in assessing the evidence either way. So that's bonus one. And bonus two is, if we are, I can do this more easily because I did used to believe. I can put myself in sort of prayer mode, and that if I'm kind of telling myself I'm talking to someone who knows everything, then it is a good exercise in being genuine to myself and not fooling myself. That I'm feeling, well, if there really is a God there and I really are asking him to lead me to truth, then that means I'm committing myself to truth and not just playing games. So it's a nice psychological exercise to check I'm not being self-deceptive.
Yes, nice. If all you want is an answer to a question, then lovely. Pray to God for his help and think about it as hard and as honestly as you can, and read and pursue the arguments wherever they lead. Absolutely. But if what you want is to choose a way of life, if to choose a religion or to choose not to be religious, then maybe going to some churches would also come into it.
I when I was just leaving Christianity, I chose to go to the odd mosque and a Baha'i group and this and that, just to get a wider feel for it all.
I think isn't there a song, Steve? Choosing my religion. No.
Losing my religion.
Losing my religion.
Yeah.
Oh, that's more like it for this podcast anyway. But you
Should
can have a
be your
progressive
theme
Christian
tune.
version.
Indeed,
Choosing
yeah.
my religion. Yeah, indeed.
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
Ed, time to move on a bit. Perhaps,
Steve.
Steve.
Steve, you've been our willing chum now, up till now.
Yeah.
Be prepared.
Yeah, be prepared. And
Okay.
if we lose all of our audios and just have Steve's, it'll just be Steve on the 4th of December. Yes. Okay. So this section then is going to be a guest interview with Steve, who you already got to know a little bit. And so let's interview Steve.
Okay, Steve, so now comes the part of the show where we'd like to find out some more about you. And I was there at the meeting when you gave your talk. And what was so striking to me was how funny it was, because it could have been such a dry subject. And I was laughing through most of that evening.
Well, that was quite
Sorry?
a relief. Thank you. And that was quite a relief. Thank you. It would have been a long half hour without any laughter.
No, you got the audience on your side very quickly, I think, and it was a good talk.
So what we'll do is just before we get back to actually probing Steve with some questions about the talk that he did at the our Unbelievable Skeptics group, we'll just go back a little bit and ask you, Steve, about how you sort of got to where you are with the sort of knowledge and experience. I've already mentioned that you are, as a hobby, like in the same band that I'm in, and we've also had a history sort of crossing paths over the years with Christian backgrounds and journeys. And so perhaps if you could just sort of start a little bit about so sort of like a whistle-stop tour, a bit like your church history one, but a Steve one, to get us to the point of how you got your doctorate and where you did that and everything else. So take it away.
Okay, so I come from what, looking back, seems like a quite intensely conservative evangelical upbringing, which I took very seriously and internalized. When I was at university in the Christian Union, that was a kind of peak of commitment to me, and I left university determined that I would go into some kind of gritty inner city Christian youth evangelism kind of thing. But when I tried to do that, everyone said, well, you can't do that if you haven't been to Bible college. If you haven't got a degree in theology, how can you possibly do it, gritty inner city urban youth evangelism? So I went off to Bible college, to what's now the London School of Theology. And because I'd done history already, I had to do another 3-year degree in theology. I was rather good at the church history side of it. And my tutor kind of talked me into staying on and doing a PhD in church history. So I guess that's what you call getting sidetracked, really. I only went to Bible college because I wanted to do the most practical thing in the Christian world that I could imagine. And I ended up doing a PhD in church history, which is the least.
Right. Interesting. So
and how about your journey in the faith? So you say you started in a very conservative setting. and now you call yourself a progressive. So, if you outline that story.
Well, I guess for most people, doing a degree in theology kind of unpicks certainties and challenges things that you hold very firm. But then also, I think maybe it's that kind of age. I was in my 20s when a lot of people go through the same thing anyway, so I don't know how much that had to do with it. But I did feel that bit by bit, through studies or through thinking or through life experiences and whatever, all these certainties and these structures I've been brought up with were coming apart bit by bit and losing this bit of the religion, that bit of the religion, but holding on to the core. But it got to the point where I remember standing up in church reciting the creed, but missing out all the bits that I could no longer believe. And it was like a Swiss cheese. It was like a flag that had been shot to ribbons. There were so many holes in it, there was hardly anything left. And I remember thinking to myself, well, if this continues, I'm going to end up an atheist. And I was quite scared of that. It seemed very disorienting. It seemed like I was going to be outside of the world that I'd known. But that did seem to be where I was heading. And I'm not sure exactly what happened to turn me around, because, unpicking your own motives for being who you are and believing what you believe is quite tricky. But one thing that stopped me throwing myself into atheism was that I had thrown myself so passionately into conservative evangelicalism. And looking back on that with some kind of disdain and embarrassment, I could see myself throwing myself into an equally fundamentalist atheism. And I didn't want to be looking back on that with equal disdain. So I thought, let's take this gradually, take this slowly. There's nothing to be gained from throwing yourself into it. And, I think that kind of led to a feeling of having this is going to sound mad, but having a kind of calling to stand on that moderate ground between the two extremes. That there are enough fundamentalist atheists and fundamentalist religious people in the world, and I kind of like the idea of being one of the people that stands in the middle and says, you've both got a point, let's all listen to each other. And what else happened?
No, I'll just comment on that, Steve, a minute.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, go on.
I just like to comment on that, because I totally identify with everything that you just said, except I suppose the analogy I would give for you is that, when you can head down these really steep roads, if you lose your brakes, there's often these side roads that you can just quickly shoot up and you don't have to crashing to the bottom. And I think I sort of went down the bottom, and Ed did, and Francis was already down there. And it's like you've sort of got, those roads. But here's the funny thing.
I took a turn.
Here is the funny thing. Our discussion group literally gravitates to people like yourself and people like myself, and I see myself from just the other side of that line from you, because I've sat in absolute fundamentalist atheist meetings, and I sound like a conservative evangelical in defense, because I just don't sit well with that fundamentalism, because I came from it. And so I get that, and yet I stand on the agnostic, skeptic, atheistic side, but it's so close because I do not associate myself with complete fundamentalism. Ed might be a little bit further down that road, I would say, Ed, than me in terms of that place that you land. Yes. And so I totally identify, Steve, with being the other side, but closer to you than you might think. You see what I mean? And,
I think it's my personality. There's something in me I really want to be certain. I know I can't be, but I do want to be able to stand in a place where I feel I've got really good arguments to back up what I'm saying. And as I look at further evidence, it confirms it and everything. So that's probably why I choose to say, right, I am an atheist. I really don't think there is such thing as God, but of course I have to keep myself open to that. But then I throw myself into this sort of quandary and say, well, am I kind of manipulating myself in a way? Am I not following the evidence? Am I following some inner drive for certainty, which is corrupting how I see things?
Right. Yes, it's interesting. I mean, my journey is for certainty as well, and that's where I found myself with all the split views on anything, not being able to get anywhere. But it's the certainty of what I was, that I wouldn't want to become again, and that's what Steve has just said about himself. That for me to become a fundamentalist atheist in that sort of almost evangelistic atheist, it's so similar to the certainty that I'd be frightened of such certainty, if you know what I mean, because I thought I had it and changed so much that it's more like this sort of softer approach to evidence as I take, and yet I still find myself not going off that side road that Steve did that stopped him hitting the bottom, as it were, or the top, if you want to see it positively.
Well,
and there's a lot of personality in it, isn't there? I think I have the personality of someone who is very happy to live with contradictions and to be surrounded by these swirling mists of uncertainty and ignorance. And this, it's fine. Whereas other people, it's very important to know what they believe and to believe it for the right reason.
Well, I was just going to tell you something about my experience of atheist fundamentalists, a group I used to belong to and that I left, which was an entirely atheist group. Couldn't really ever see what the fun was of that. I mean, why would you just what? But anyway, one of the meetings they had, the debate subject was about challenging language. And avoiding the use of terms such as miracle, like, it's a miracle. So, in this car crash, the baby survived. It's a miracle. Or it's a miracle they got somebody out of there. Or, wishing people happy Christmas. Or saying bless you when somebody sneezes. I was like, oh, for goodness sake,
It's like political correctness.
What sort of ambassadors for atheism are you being? If somebody wishes you happy Christmas and you're like, well, I don't think we need to bring Christ into this, or bless you. Oh, blessing me will do no good. Can I have some medicine, please? Just get over yourself.
Excellent.
But that sounds so exactly like some Christians I've known who, if you say good luck, will say, I don't believe in luck, I believe in God. It's the same thing, isn't it?
Yes, you do get the flip side. That's the point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was brought up like that, gambling was wrong and this, that, and the other. And you don't want to say, well, that was good luck, because it's like, wow, where's God? Where's your God? So
I want to move things along a bit.
Yes, do indeed.
So, Steve, your kind of thing is a show, this comedy show we mentioned, and also a book you wrote. So you're not being paid to come on this podcast, but we will give you the opportunity just to say what your products are. So tell us about the book, and also if people are interested in booking you for the show, I'm sure you'd be quite pleased to hear from them. So tell us about that as well.
Okay, I've written a number of books. This particular one is called A Short History of Christianity. It's not quite as short as the show. It's a normal length paperback book. It covers the whole of 2,000 years in, 200 pages. The other books I've written are also on religious history and biography. You can find out about them all at stephentomkins.com. That's Stephen with a PH and Tomkins without a P or an H. It's not the best name to have in a URL. And you can contact me there as well if you want.
And of course, it's PhD. Talking about PhD.
And are you keen to do shows around the place? I know you're coming to us in High Wycombe in February.
I am, yes.
Great.
Invite me to come, and I expect I will.
Yeah, Jesus said the same sort of thing, I think. Yes, that's right.
You don't know the hour or the day at which
that's
I'll
right.
turn up, but I'll be there.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So do you think, Steve, when we look at the whole of church history, so sort of getting on to the more meaty bit now, do you think there's some kind of take-home that we can derive from that when we're going to look at church history in the sweep?
It's a long and complicated story, but I guess probably the main take home for me, having looked at it, is that in general, and this is a big generality, but in general, Christianity seems to have worked better, seems to have stayed true to Jesus and done good in the world when the church has been what it was at first, the spiritual community in a non-Christian world. When the church has had power, it's been corrupted, and when the church has been an entire Christian society, it's been a bit of a monster. So, on the one hand, back in the days of the pagan invasions of Western Europe, you had monasteries providing refuge and hospitality. That's a great model for what the church should be. More recently, in recent centuries, Quakers and the evangelicals fighting slavery and Methodists fighting for workers' rights. That's all examples of the church making a contribution to wider society from the fringes as a minority. Whereas, you compare that to the medieval papacy and the persecution of Jews and heretics and the abomination of desolation that is United States evangelicalism today. So I suppose my take home would be, don't give Christians power, don't put them in charge. The church isn't a whole Christian society, it's a spiritual community.
That's interesting.
That's good.
That's very interesting in the sense that the Christianity that I grew up with was trying to take over the world and make everyone Christian. And so I wonder what the reality would have been if that did happen, probably like the hints you've said. Would it really work at all? And yet that was the goal that I thought was the goal of evangelicalism, was trying to evangelize everybody. At the same time as knowing only a fraction of the world would be saved. So it's kind of contradictory in a way as well. But anyway,
isn't it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is these different diverse things. But some of the questions then, Ed, I think you're going to be leading on to, that are going to talk about what was referenced in the talk and from Steve's book. We can sort of
something I kind of got from it was that I really didn't see any hint of God's involvement guiding things in the history of Christianity. There didn't seem to be any aspect of that, certainly as came out from the talk and from a book I read from several years ago on church history. So is that a fair assessment?
Yep.
Next question.
Right, next question. Okay, yeah.
Give you a little bit of that one. You just have to look at the history of anti-Semitism in the church to answer that. As early as the 4th century of Christian history, you had the church leaders burning synagogues and destroying Jewish scriptures, and people who are today revered as saints of the church, like St. John Chrysostom, preaching sermons that we still have of his today, saying that he hated Jews and Christians should hate the Jews as Christ killers and devil worshippers. And this hatred of Jewish people had built up over just a few centuries from what had started off as a Jewish sect that had bent over backwards and all the way back round again in order to let Gentiles in on terms that they could live with. And these non-Jewish Christians had taken over the church and turned it into something that then in the Middle Ages was habitually doing pogroms and massacres against the Jewish people. The most popular time of year for killing Jews was Easter, Good Friday. They killed Jesus, so we'll kill them back again. It's enough to make you hate medieval Catholicism until you get to the Protestant reformers who, Luther, he started off believing that that Protestantism would be the thing that brought the promised conversion of the Jews, and Luther tried to convert the Jews. When they didn't accept his invitation, over the years he became increasingly anti-Jewish, and towards the end of his life he was writing about what a good thing it would be to burn synagogues and ban Jewish prayers and force the Jews into farm labor. So, he is a father of the German anti-Semitism of the 20th century. And even as late as the 1960s, it was the Second Vatican Council of, 1963, that for the first time absolved the Jews from the guilt of the crucifixion, which up until then Catholic teaching had said the Jews are responsible for the crucifixion, and so that was passed in 1963, and it was passed by a vote of 75% of 1,000 delegates. So there were 250 people still there voting in favor of still blaming the Jews for the crucifixion of Christ. So the whole story is utterly depressing for me as a Christian. It has been one of the things which has most made me despair of the faith and wonder if it has anything going for it at all.
I believe Hitler was very much influenced by Luther, and some of the parallels between Hitler's regime and Luther's suggestions are uncanny when I've did some research into that. And I don't know whether you think that's true or not, but I certainly seem to get that idea. The
Nazis certainly used Luther as a justification and support of what they were doing.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
And they also exploited a history of Christian anti-Semitism, and the church had a very checkered history in relation to anti-Semitism in terms of the way it reacted to the Nazi oppression of the Jews. There was a certain amount of, I suppose you might say, giving with one hand and taking away with the other. So there would be condemnation of the Nazis, but very often it was kind of put in the context of, but on the other hand, the Jews have nobody but themselves to blame. I mean, what do they expect? They're so dreadful. But even so, we think the Nazis have they've really gone a bit over the top. Yes, there's some quite some quite shocking things in which Christianity and a history of anti-Semitism was harnessed and exploited by the Nazis. And I don't think anyone would suggest that anti-Semitism was entirely the fault of Christianity, but there was something in Christianity that did provide fertile soil for the growth of Nazi anti-Semitism, something which it could take hold of.
It's not just that, actually, from my research into it, that actually a lot of the responsibility, or some of it, comes down to actually New Testament texts themselves in Matthew and John that were taken a certain way. And I think people now, sort of mainstream scholars, say that actually these texts are really about infighting between different Jewish groups, like the Jews and the leaders of the Jews against each other, rather than anti-Jewish statements. But in the letter of Barnabas, even, apparently it's quite anti-Jewish already in the 2nd century. And those seeds of the New Testament phrases got picked up, and it was amazing to see the early church turn against the Jews so quick. Like, I think, Steve, you said in the talk, 100 years later, they basically reversed the principle. Is that right?
Yes, in Spain.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, in around about 300, Spanish churches decreed that any Christians who ate meals with Jewish people should be excommunicated, which
is amazing, because you've got the New Testament itself with the story the other way around. It's like
Peter and Cornelius.
Can I pick up something else?
How can we bend the Jewish law to allow the Gentiles to come and eat with us? Turned it completely on its head.
Can I pick up something else from the talk that really struck me? So that this is the thing, maybe it struck me more than anything else, and that's just sort of towards the beginning of the story. We're talking about maybe 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. The way that martyrdom was such an important concept and driver for the early Christians. It wasn't just they kind of revered their founder as a martyr, but martyrdom for Christians was this sort of almost a goal to aim for, and it became almost like Monty Python-like, with asking the local governor to martyr you, and the local governor refused because you've not done anything bad enough. And the way that fed on into the future Christianity is that, particularly, you mentioned a link between that and these sort of desert hermits that then a few centuries later morphed into monasteries. So do you want to pick up on that and talk about it a bit more, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, it does all go back to Jesus, as Christianity should do. When you think about it, it's a very unusual thing, isn't it, for a religion to be founded on the execution of its founder, and then so many other of the first generation of Christian leaders were killed. Stephen and Peter and Paul and a couple of Jameses. I think John is the only apostle that we know of who died a natural death. And in those circumstances, it's natural, isn't it, that the church should tell this story about the martyrs, that all believers will be raised from the dead, but the martyrs go on to a greater glory. And already in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, there's a vision of the throne room of Christ with all these people standing around in white robes and victory palms. And these are the ones who came through the great tribulation. Their robes are white because they are washed in blood. But if that's the case, then for anyone who wants to be great in the kingdom of God, it's not enough to be a servant of all, as Jesus said. You have to be martyred. So Christians, as you say, deliberately tried to be executed. The 3rd century theologian Origen only failed to get martyred because his mum hid his clothes, and churches had to ban members from handing themselves over. Not all Christians wanted to be thrown to the lions, but there was absolutely this cult of martyrdom as a way to be a super Christian. So then when the emperor of Rome, Constantine, became a Christian, that put a stop to all that, and suddenly the whole empire wants to be in the church. And that's when all this hermiting started. The hermits went out into the desert in their thousands separately, and that was their way of being not of the world, now that the whole world has joined the church. And they lived in caves that were too small to sit up straight. They lived in gnat-infested swamps, ate nothing but grass, beat themselves up, lived on the top of huge pillars, because they wanted to be martyred, but they couldn't be anymore. Constantine had put a stop to all that, so they had to martyr themselves.
Wow, that changes a lot of the common talk on persecution of Christians. Like we're the completely persecuted group here, and maybe that was true here and there, but this does another spin to it. It's like a glory theology of martyrdom itself coming out.
Sorry. I was going to say, I think to this day, Christians hanker after martyrdom and try and...
Play the martyr, you mean? Like play the martyr. Yeah.
Play the martyr. Yes. I mean, I think you get, I feel that quite a lot of these news stories, Christians are seeing martyrdom in their treatment when it isn't necessarily there.
Oh, I remember hearing, it was some years ago now, a quote from someone in ISIS saying something on the lines of, you Westerners will never overcome us because you are people who love to live. We are people who love to die. And that's why you can never defeat us. And I thought, my God, that sounds so exactly like it could have come from, I'm thinking specifically of the early Christian writer Tertullian, who spoke exactly like that, the empire, saying, you think you're overcoming us because you're killing us all, but you don't realize it's only because we choose to die that you are able to kill us. So at the moment, when you kill us, we are vanquishing you. The blood of Christians is seed. The more you mow us down, the more we grow. It's
the blood of the martyrs.
Yeah.
And I will say on behalf of Christians that they looked at it that they were the ones who were going to die. They weren't going to take other people with them, generally. I think.
Yes, that's very true. That is an important.
Yeah, that is true. The seeds of that, Steve, probably come from the Book of Revelation, which we've referenced already, and probably Ed's going to bring it up later. But you've got the blood of the martyrs there, and very much the beheading sort of situation. Ironically, talking about ISIS and the beheadings, you've got beheading in Book of Revelation of the martyrs, which is sort of like a reverse thing in a way. But this martyrdom theology, again, just like the anti-Jewish thing, the seeds are in text in the New Testament. anyway.
Do you think the martyrdom thing has contributed to Christianity's success in like taking over the Roman Empire and then spreading through Europe after the Anglo-Saxon tribes, say, came to Britain and made it back to a pagan nation? And
yes, I mean, apart from anything, having that attitude to martyrdom was very important to the survival of the church, because you can wipe out religious movements by killing them all. It has happened. The Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages did that to a lot of religious movements. But if you have this attitude to martyrdom, that's what your faith is all about, then that can spawn imitators who, as Tertullian said, the more you mow us down, the more we grow. It can turn martyrdom to something in your favor, that instead of being wiped out by it, you're just grown by it.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
And also, it made Christianity very different to anything else that was on offer. So it really impressed. Some Romans, some were appalled and horrified and thought they were a bunch of nutters, obviously. But there were Romans who were just intrigued. What is this religion that's worth dying for?
That does, yeah. That really is something different. That's interesting.
Okay, Andrew, what struck you from the talk?
Actually, what struck me, that's a good point that you should make. It was a lot of striking of each other, I think, in the Christian, because what really did, again, it's funny, isn't it, Ed? You can listen to it and sort of tune into that. Francis, you can tune into that aspect that grabs you, because we're all different personalities. But for me, it was like not just the same as you, Ed, in the sense that this looks equally like random human history, as opposed to some sort of divine reality going on, because it seems so sort of random. And yet one theme that wasn't random seemed to be the incredible amount of violence done by Christian people of one stripe or another to other human beings, in a way that most Christians today are very, very see as almost like barbaric times of the age. And it's not unlike looking at the Old Testament and still having that same queasy feeling inside that somehow this is against humanity in a wrong way. And yet the sanction of the Christian thought, it seems like the strand of Jesus has different strands as far as my view is, but this one strand of Jesus teaching is like the Sermon on the Mount and love your enemies, and this sort of idea of not taking up the sword and turning the other cheek. Now, people have different interpretations, but there's an essence that people take in a pacifistic way on those elements quite a lot. And yet that seems to have been brushed completely under the carpet by the mainstream. I know the Anabaptists come in and start to challenge some of this. But Steve, what would you say about that the violence doesn't look unlike the violence of all the other nations of the world, but just the language of Jesus is there, and yet doesn't seem to change a thing about the way humans have treated other humans? For
me, this goes back to what I was saying about the two different models of what the church is, or whether it's a whole Christian society, like the Christianization of the Roman Empire, or whether it's a spiritual community within a society like the Church of Jesus was. Now, if it's a community within society like Jesus founded, then you can afford to treat people decently, because if you argue over your faith, if you can't get someone to agree with you, and it's something very serious, and it's the parting of the ways, you can just kick them out of your church, or you can leave their church. And movements like that tend to split up a lot, but they don't do violence to people. They just go their own separate ways, because if you're a community, you can start another community. But if your church is an entire religious faith of an entire society, like the Catholic Church of Middle-Age Europe, medieval Europe, then you need to hold the entire nation together in one faith. And in order to do that, you have to stop people disagreeing. And so when they do disagree, which inevitably happens, you have to use force. So that model model of a church, that it's a whole Christian nation, a whole Christian society, inevitably forces you, even if you don't want to resort to coercion, because otherwise you then end up with more than one faith in society, and the whole thing collapses. Goes back to being what we now have, which is different churches as communities within the wider society. So that's another reason why I think it's very important that the church is a community within society, because then it doesn't have the incentive to use violence on people to force them to agree.
Francis, you have some comments on that from Steve?
I can see that's a good way of explaining why it is that there is this coercion, because there is this political aspect. But no, I've got nothing else to add.
I tell you what I don't understand at all is why doctrine became so important to the church, and why it was what people believed about who Jesus is that was the source of all this violence, because other religions weren't like that. The religions of the Roman Empire weren't like that. Judaism wasn't like that. No. They had their arguments, they had their conflicts, they had their things that were important to them. But why? It's not there in the New Testament, so I don't know where it was that the church got the idea that everyone had to believe the right thing about who Jesus was and what he was made of, and that was going to be the thing that they were going to kill each other about. But that's where they ended up, for whatever reason it is.
Yeah, it is interesting that even the development of the Trinity, which isn't explicitly sort of in the New Testament, as it was evolving and changing, even the early people who were on the so-called proto-Orthodox line, getting closer to what the traditional form of the Trinity was, later forms that developed were then sort of saying that the earlier ones who helped them along were heretics, and they weren't saved, and some of these people, salvation, again, talk about Pascal's Wager, was completely thrown all over the place by the different views of how to understand the nature of Jesus and his oneness with the Father. It's incredible. And again, my teenage fundamentalism was very much like, you're not got to believe the rights. We were charismatics. We weren't them cessationists, for goodness sake. We were charismatic. We believe in the gifts of the Spirit, the true Christians. It's like, or at least the truer form. There's
so many different opinions on offer, so many different opinions in conflict with each other, and if you have enough faith, you can look back and say it is a true miracle that out of all those different ideas, the one true faith managed to fight its way through, and God brought that into victory. But obviously to the rest of us, it just looks like natural selection.
Exactly. Ed probably have something to say on that. You were going to say something.
What Ed would say is I think it has been absolutely fantastic, but I think we're running out of time.
We are running out of time because the rapture is about to occur, and sorry.
So I think we must just tell us again, Steve. Give us that link again, so people can find you and your work.
StephenTomkins.com.
Okay.
You can just Google Steve Tomkins, God or something.
Yeah.
That would
keep your H's and T's out of Tomkins.
To me.
Well, we were going to talk about the Book of Revelation and a few other questions, but we have run out of time. This is a very extended episode, but well worth it. So thank you, Steve. And I have been your host, Andrew.
And I've been Francis.
I'm Ed. And who are you, Steve?
I'm Steve.
That's great. Okay. Until next time, when we will be episode 12. Bye for now.
Bye.
Hello. It's nice to see you all here. Now, as the more perceptive of you have probably realized by now, this is hell. And I am the devil. Now, you're all here for eternity. Ooh. Which I hardly need tell you is a heck of a long time. So you'll all get to know each other pretty well by the end. But for now, I'm going to have to split you up into groups. Will you stop screaming? The French, are you here? Okay. If you'd just like to come down here with the Germans, that'd be lovely. I'm sure you'll have plenty to talk about. Okay, atheists. Atheists, over here, please. You must be feeling a right bunch of nitwits. Huh? Never mind. And finally, Christians. Christians. Ah, yes, I'm sorry. I'm afraid the Jews were right. If you could come down here, that'd be really kind. Thank you. Okay. Right. Well, are there any questions?